The first time I drove up to the Stroud place, I had 2 ice chests of food in the back of a borrowed truck, and a secret I had meant to carry all the way to my own grave. The funeral was set for 3 o'clock. I got there at 11, so the brisket would have time to rest, and the cobbler would have time to set, and because I have never once in my life walked into a kitchen that wasn't already running behind. The house sat up on a limestone rise above a creek, a long, low ranch house with a tin roof gone the color of weak coffee, and there was a man standing down at the corral when I pulled in. He didn't wave. He just watched the truck come up the drive the way you watch whether you aren't sure about yet. I want to tell you the truth from the start, because there isn't much point in a story a person has to lie their way through. The old man they were burying that afternoon was named Cleve Hardesty. The church ladies in Junction had hired me to cook the meal because no kin had come forward to do it, and a man can't be put in the ground in Kimball County without somebody feeding the people who come to watch. But there was kin. I was his kin. I was his daughter, and I had not said his name out loud in 19 years. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Nobody there knew that, you understand. They knew me as Della Quint, the woman who cooks for funerals and church suppers and the occasional wedding all up and down the river. Quint was my husband's name. Ronnie Quint has been in the ground himself a good while now. 8 years this past winter, and I kept his name because it was easier than explaining why a grown woman would want to go back to a name she'd run away from at 17. So I was Della Quint, the cook, hired and paid and not expected to feel anything beyond whether beans had enough salt. I carried the first chest up to the house, and a woman met me at the screen door, heavy-set, kind-faced, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. She introduced herself as Wanda, said she ran the altar guild over at the little Methodist church, said it wasn't just the saddest thing, an old man dying alone with not one soul to claim him. "Did you know him?" she asked me. "Mr. Hardesty?" "No, ma'am," I said. "I never had the pleasure." The lie came out smooth as cream. I had been lying about my own father. So long it had stopped feeling like lying. It just felt like the weather of my life, the thing I lived inside. The Stroud house was where they were holding the meal because the Strouds owned the only place big enough nearby, and because old Cleve had spent the last stretch of his life in a lined shack on the far back edge of their lease, and somebody had decided that made him near enough to theirs to feed his mourners under their roof. I learned all this from Wanda while I set up in a kitchen that hadn't been properly cleaned in a long while. There was dust on top of the refrigerator and a stack of unopened mail by the toaster and a child's sock under the table that I picked up and set on the windowsill without thinking, the way you do in another woman's house when that woman is gone. Because she was gone. I could feel it before anybody told me. A house tells you. There was a quilt frame set up in the front room with a quilt half finished on it, a wedding ring pattern in blues and faded yellows, and the needle was still stuck in the cloth, right where somebody had laid it down meaning to come back. Nobody had touched it. There was a recipe box on the counter, the metal kind with a hinged lid, and the cards were in a woman's handwriting, and a man's hand doesn't leave a recipe box sitting out like that unless he can't bring himself to put away. The man from the corral came in around noon. He took his hat off at the door, which I noticed because so many of them don't anymore. He was tall and going gray at the temples, sunburned across the back of his neck the way a man gets when he spends his life looking down at cattle and up at the sky and not much in between. He had a way of standing very still. He looked at the food spread across the counters, the foil pans and the pots, and then he looked at me, and there was something in how he looked that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't rude. It wasn't the up and down a certain kind of man gives a woman. It was more like he'd forgotten there was such a thing as another person moving around in his kitchen, and the sight of it had caught him sideways. "You the cook," he said. Not really a question. "Della Quint." I wiped my hand on my apron and held it out. "I'm sorry for your loss." He wasn't mine to lose. He shook my hand anyway. His was rough and dry and swallowed mine whole. "Emmett Stroud, this is my place. Was glad to give it for the day." He looked again at the half-finished quilt in the front room, then back at me, like he'd caught me looking at it too, which I had. "Don't mind the house," he said quietly. "We've let some things go." "It's a good kitchen," I said. "Good light." I don't know why I said that. It was true. The window over the sink faced east, and the morning came in clean. But it landed on him strange. He stood there another second, and I watched something move behind his face. And then he put his hat back on and said he had to go see about the chairs. And he went back out into the heat. That was the first time. I'd be a liar if I told you I felt the whole rest of my life turn over right then. It didn't. Mostly I felt the thing I felt driving in, which was a low, sick dread in my belly that I was about to stand over a hole in the ground and watch them lower my daddy into it and not be able to so much as cry. Because the cook doesn't cry. The cook stays in the kitchen and keeps the tea cold. They buried him at 2:30 in a little fence plopped back behind a stand of pecan trees, on a piece of ground that turned out later to matter more than anybody standing there could have known. There were maybe 20 people. The Methodist preacher said the things they say. He called Cleve a hard worker and a quiet man and a child of God, and every word that was true and none of it was the man. And I stood at the back with my hands folded over my apron and looked at the cedar fence posts and the dry grass and the long blue line of the hills, and I did not make one sound. Emmett Stroud stood near the front with 2 children, a girl about 14, all sharp elbows and a face shut tight as a fist, who would not look at the grave, and a little boy, maybe 8, who held on to the back of his father's belt with one hand and looked at everything with big, serious eyes. I learned their names that evening. June, who everybody called Junie, and Asa, Emmett's children. Their mother was a woman of the quilt and the recipe box, and she'd been dead 2 years that spring, and the whole household was still standing in the hole she'd left, the same way the rest of us were standing around a hole they'd dug for my father. I noticed Emmett looking at me again during the service, across all those bowed heads. I had my eyes down, but I felt it. And when I glanced up, he didn't look away, which a polite man is supposed to do. He just held my eyes for a second with that same caught expression, and then the preacher said, "Amen," and it was over, and there was a meal to put out. So I went and put it out. Here's a thing I have learned from cooking other people's grief for a living. People can't cry and chew at the same time, and that is the whole point of the funeral meal. You give them something to do with their hands and their mouths, so the sorrow has somewhere to go that isn't out loud. I have fed mourners who hadn't eaten in 3 days fall on a plate of chicken and dumplings like it was the body and blood, because the body in the ground was the only one they couldn't have, and a person has to put something in the empty place. So I worked. I kept the brisket coming and the cobbler dished and the tea poured, and I listened, because the cook is invisible and people talk in front of the invisible. And what I heard, standing at that counter in my dead father's borrowed funeral, was the beginning of the thing I'm telling you about. I heard about the Strouds. Emmett's older brother arrived late, after the burial, in a dual-wheel truck cleaner than any working truck has a right to be. Carl Stroud. He came in loud, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, the kind of man who walks into a room of grieving people and somehow makes it about how busy he is. He was bigger than Emmett and softer, with a gold watch and a belt buckle size of saucer, and he had a laugh he used like a tool. He took a plate without a word to me, which was fine. I'm used to it. But I watched him eat my brisket and survey the house like he was pricing it, and something in me went still and careful the way it does. Sad deal. Carl said to not a man by the door, loud enough for the room. Old Cleve. Worked these places 50 years, and didn't have a pot to his name. Just goes to show you. You got to plan. In this life, you got to think ahead. He shook his head like Cleve's poverty was a moral failing, and not something that had been done to him. Daddy carried that old man for years out of pure Christian kindness. Let him live out there in that shack rent-free, when he couldn't pull his weight no more. That's the kind of people we are. I had a pan of cobbler in my hands, and I set it down very carefully so I wouldn't throw it, because I knew I was maybe the only living person in that room who knew the real shape of it. I knew what the Strouds had done to my father, because I had been a girl in the house when it happened, and it was the reason I had run off at 17 and never come back. But I didn't know yet how much I didn't know. I thought the wound was old and dead and buried with him. I had no idea it was about to come up out of the ground like a spring after rain. Carl found me at the counter when the crowd thinned. He had that look certain men get, friendly on top and calculating underneath. "You did good," he said, gesturing at the wreckage of the meal. "Wanda find you. Were you local?" "I'm out from town." I said. "Wanda hired me." "Quint," she said. He was watching my face. Don't believe I know any Quints. Married into it. From down the river. Huh. He kept looking at me a beat too long. Something in him was uneasy, and he didn't know why, and I knew exactly why, and I gave him nothing. I had a lifetime of practice, giving men like Carl Stroud nothing. Well, he said finally, we appreciate it. You can leave the pans. Somebody will run 'em back to you. I'll take my own pans. I said, thank you. He didn't like that. A hired cook telling him how it would go, but he let it pass, and he drifted off to be important at somebody else. It was near dark by the time I had the kitchen put back together. The mourners had gone. Junie had disappeared somewhere with her shut face. Asa had fallen asleep on the couch with a one-eared dog curled against him, a homely brown thing the boy called Biscuit. And Emmett came in and stood looking at the two of them, his son and the dog, and his shoulders came down about an inch. And for just that second, he looked like what he was, which was a tired man who missed his wife. You need a hand carrying out? He asked me. I've got it. Let me carry the chests anyhow. He picked one up before I could argue, and we went out into the blue evening, the locusts going to cedar, the hills gone purple, and the first stars coming up over the windmill that turned slow on a rise to the east. He set the chest in the truck bed and stood there a minute, not in any hurry, which I would learn was just his way. He was a man who had stopped being in a hurry the day his wife died, because hurry is for people who think the worst thing hasn't happened yet. You knew him, Emmett said. It wasn't a question, the same way you the cook hadn't been. I went very still. What makes you say that? I said, the way you stood at the grave. He looked out at the dark, not at me, which I was grateful for. Everybody else was looking at the box, or at the preacher, or at their boots. You were looking at him, at the man, like you were saying something to him. He shrugged, like he was sorry to have noticed. I bury enough things out here. You get to where you can tell the difference between a stranger and somebody who's lost something. I had a choice right there in the dark, and I made the wrong one, or maybe the only one I had left in me. I cook a lot of funerals, I said. You learn to grieve a little for all of them. Otherwise, you couldn't do it. He looked at me then, and he knew I was lying, and he let me. That's the thing about Emmett Stroud. I came to love before I'd admit it to myself. He always knew, and he always let you keep your lie until you were ready to set it down. He didn't pry it out of you. He just made room and waited. All right, he said. He stepped back from the truck. You drive safe, Mrs. Quint. Long way back to town in the dark. Della, I said. I don't know why. Della, he said. I drove home in the dark with my dead father in the ground behind me, and a stranger's grief sitting on me like a second skin, and a tall, quiet man's face in my mind. And I thought that was the end of it. I had buried him. I had fed his mourners. The book was closed. It was 3 days later that the lawyer called. His name was Cobb, an old man with an office on the square in Junction, the kind of small-town lawyer who's drawn up half the wills and settled half the fence lines in the county over 40 years. He asked was I Della Hardesty. Not Quint. Hardesty, my maiden name, the one I'd buried deeper than my father. I sat down at my own kitchen table. The room went small and far away. Where did you get that name? I said, from Cleve Hardesty's last will and testament. Cobb said, gentle as you please, like he'd done this 1,000 times, which he had, which I drew up for him myself, going on 9 years ago. You're his daughter, Mrs. Quint. He named you. You're the sole beneficiary of his estate. And there are some things you need to come in and hear, and I'd as soon you heard them sitting down. He didn't have anything, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. Everybody said he died with nothing. They said he didn't have a pot. There was a pause on the line. When old Cobb spoke again, his voice had changed, and there was something in it that I would come to understand was a kind of grim satisfaction, the satisfaction of an honest man who has waited a long time to watch the truth come out. Mrs. Quint, he said, your daddy had a good deal more than anybody around here ever knew. He had it the whole time. He just never said. Now, can you come Thursday? I want to stop here and tell you about my father, the real man, because the preacher didn't and Carl Stroud surely didn't, and somebody ought to. Cleve Hardesty was born on the place his own grandfather had homesteaded back when Kimball County was the raw edge of nothing. The Hardesty Quarter, they called it. 160 acres, Section 14, sitting against what would later become the Stroud Range, and it didn't look like much, just cedar and limestone and live oak and dry grass like all the rest of it. But it had the one thing that is worth more than gold in that country. The thing every cow and every man and every blade of grass lives and dies by out there. It had water. There was a spring on the Hardesty Quarter, a real spring, cold and steady, coming up clear out of the rock in a little draw shaded by old pecans, and it fed a creek that ran down to the Stroud ground and on to the South Llano. In a country where the rivers can go to gravel in August and the stock tanks dry to crack mud, that spring never quit. My great-great-grandfather had filed on the water rights to it before Texas had finished sorting out who owned what. He'd done it properly, the way you did then, and the priority date on the Hardesty water right was 1911. First in time, first in right. That's the law of water in dry country, and it's older than any of us. The first man to put the water to use holds the senior claim, and everybody who comes after stands behind him in line. And in a drought, the senior right gets his water first, and the rest get what's left, which is sometimes nothing. The Strouds didn't even buy their ground until 1937, when Burl Stroud's daddy dug his own diversion off that creek to water his east pastures. The year was 1949, and that made the Stroud claim 38 years junior to ours. Junior by a generation. In the eyes of the law, every drop the Strouds took, they took behind my family. They could only have it if there was enough left over after the Hardesty right was satisfied. My father knew all this. He'd grown up knowing it the way you know your own name. And here's the part that took me 40 years and a phone call from an old lawyer to understand. He never gave it up. When I was a girl, there came a string of dry years, the kind that break men. 3 summers running with no rain to speak of, and we were cash poor like everybody, and Burl Stroud came around. Burl was Carl and Emmett's father, and he was a hard, smiling, grasping man, the kind who could ruin you and have you thanking him for it. He came around with money, in dry times the way a coyote comes around a sick calf. He offered to buy our cattle, offered low, because he knew we were desperate, and my father, who was prouder than he could afford to be, took the deal because the alternative was watching the cows die. And then Burl did the thing that I didn't understand as a child, and I've hated every day since I did. He just started taking the water. All of it. He told my father that since the Hardesty cattle were gone, the Hardesty water wasn't being put to use. And water you don't use, you lose. There's a hard grain of truth in that. Abandonment, they call it. But it isn't near as simple as Burl made it sound. And a senior right isn't lost just because a broke man has a couple of dry years. But my father was beaten down and grieving because my mother had passed that same spring, and he didn't have the fight or the money for a lawyer, and Burl Stroud counted on exactly that. He bet that Cleve Hardesty was too poor and too proud and too sad to stand up for what was his. And for a long while, he was right. The Strouds prospered on our water. They built their whole operation on the back of that spring, 3, for 100 mother cows running on grass that only stayed green because of water that, in the eyes of the law, was never theirs to take. And my father moved off into a line shack and lived poor and silent for the rest of his life, while everybody in the county clucked their tongues about old Cleve, who never could get ahead. And I, God forgive me, believed them. I was 17, and I saw a beaten man who let himself be robbed, and I couldn't stand it. And I ran off and married the first boy who'd take me away from it. And I never went back, and I let 19 years go by, and then they put in the ground, and I cooked the brisket. What I didn't know, what nobody knew, was what my father did in the quiet of all those years. He never sold the Hardesty quarter. He never deeded it over, no matter how Burl pressured him, and Burl pressured him hard. The 160 acres with the spring on it stayed in Cleve Hardesty's name, recorded down at the county courthouse, where anybody could have looked if they'd thought to. And the water right, the senior 1911 right, he never abandoned in law, whatever Burl claimed. My father, that silent man everybody pitied, drove to Junction one quiet day and sat down with Old Cobb and made sure of it. He filed the papers. He kept the right alive on paper, even after he'd stopped fighting for it, in fact. He paid the taxes on that quarter section every single year out of almost nothing, scraping it together so the place could never be taken for back taxes, so it would be free and clear and his to give. He was keeping it for me. He couldn't say the words to me. We were both too much alike, too proud, too wounded, and the silence between us had set up hard as concrete, and neither one of us could break it. But he kept the land and the water, all those poor and lonely years, so that one day his daughter would have the one thing the Strouds could never steal. He held it in trust the only way he knew how, which was to hold his tongue and pay the taxes and wait. I learned all of this on a Thursday, in Cobb's dusty office on the square, with the courthouse clock chiming a half hour through the open window. Cobb laid out for me piece by piece, and he had every document. The deed to Section 14, in Cleve Hardesty's name, free and clear. The certificate of adjudication for the water right, priority date 1911, senior to every other claim on that creek. The tax receipts, 40 years of them, going back before I was born, in my father's cramped, careful hand. And a letter. The letter was the thing that broke me. Cobb handed it across the desk in a yellowed envelope with my name on the front and my father's writing, Della, just a one word, and I held a long time before I could open it. And when I did, the whole shut room of my life came open with it. I'm not going to read you the whole of it. Some things are too much your own. But I'll tell you he wrote that he was sorry, that he'd been a hard man and a poor father, and he knew it, that he'd let Burl Stroud take the water because he couldn't bear to lose anything else the year my mother died, and that he regretted it every day after, not for the water, but because he thought it was the day I stopped looking up to him. And he was right, it was. He wrote that he kept the place for me because it was the only way he had left to say the thing he couldn't say out loud. He wrote that he hoped I'd come home someday and stand by the spring and forgive him. He wrote that the water was the truest thing the family ever had, and that it had been waiting for me my whole life, the same as he had. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I sat in that office and cried for a man I'd spent 19 years being angry at, and old Cobb had the decency to go stand at the window and look at the square until I was done. There's the matter of what's being done with the water, Cobb said when I gathered myself. He sat back down and folded his hands on the desk. The Stroud operation has been diverting off that creek for better than 70 years. They've never held Senior right to a drop of it. Your daddy let it lie, and the law's got patience for that only so far, but he kept the right alive. And now it passes to you, clean. Mrs. Quint, you own the water that keeps half the Stroud Ranch green. You own the quarter section their best pasture leans against. And you are within your rights to call that water every acre-foot of it, starting the day you walk out of here. I thought about Carl Stroud and his gold watch, eating my brisket, telling that room what good Christian people the Strouds were for letting my broke father die in their shack. I thought about the cobbler I'd nearly thrown. And then I thought about a tall, quiet man taking his hat off at the door, standing over his sleeping boy, knowing I'd lied and letting me keep it. A man whose whole life was that grass and those cattle. A man who had nothing to do with what his father did. Because Emmett would have been a boy himself when Burl took the water, no older than Junie. Does he know? I asked Emmett, does he know any of this? Cobb took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I'd have to say no, he said slowly. Burl Stroud was the kind of man who kept his sins in his own pocket. I expect he went to his grave thinking he'd gotten clean away with it. Carl, now. He paused. Carl was 16, 17 when it happened. Old enough to know. I always wonder how much Carl carried. But Emmett, he shook his head. Emmett Stroud's an honest man. If Emmett knew his whole ranch was running on stolen water, I don't believe he'd sleep a night. No, I'd say Emmett doesn't know the first thing about it. That changed everything, though I didn't let on, because a person can ruin a man who robbed him and call it justice. But I had no taste at all for ruining a man whose only crime was being his father's son, a man already half drowned in his own grief, with 2 children standing in the hole their mother left. What do I do? I said, more to myself than to Cobb. That, the old lawyer said, is the one thing in all this I can't tell you. The law'll give you the water. What you do with it is between you and your conscience and the Lord. He put his glasses back on. But I'll say this. There's going to have to be a conversation. The estate's got to be settled. The Strouds have got to be told. And once they're told, there'll be no putting it back in the box. We set it for the next week. Cobb would gather everyone at his office, formal and proper. The reading of the estate and the disclosure of the water right, with Emmett and Carl both present and the documents on the table. The civilized way. The kind of reading I'd cooked the meal after 100 times. Except this time I wouldn't be in the kitchen. This time I'd be the one holding the deed. I didn't go back to town and wait. I couldn't. The morning after I saw Cobb, I drove out to the Hardesty Quarter, to the spring, because my father had asked me to in the letter and because I needed to see the thing this was all about. You had to go through the Stroud lease to get to it. Down a 2-track that wound through the cedar, and I half expected to be run off, but I wasn't. The line shack where my father lived out his last years was still there, gray and leaning, and I made myself go in. It was clean. That's what got me. A poor man's room, a cot and a chair and a little stove, but swept and orderly. His hat still on a nail by the door, his reading glasses folded on the windowsill next to a coffee can of pencil stubs, a blue speckled enamel coffee pot on the cold stove. He had lived small and careful and ready, like a man keeping watch. And then I walked up the draw to the spring, and I understood my father for the first time in my life. It came up out of the rock clean and silver, no more than you could have stepped across, but it ran cold and steady in the heat, and the pecans stood over it old and green, and a scissor-tail flycatcher worked the air above the water, and was the only living green thing for as far as I could see in any direction. Everything around it was burned tan and gray with the August drought, the whole country gasping for rain. And here in this one hidden draw the water came up out of the ground like a promise that had never once been broken in 100 years. I knelt down and put my hand in it, and it was so cold it ached, and I thought about my great-great-grandfather filing on it in 1911, and my father paying the taxes on it for 40 years out of nothing, keeping it for a daughter who'd run off and never wrote. And I put my face down near the water, and I said out loud to him the thing I couldn't say at the grave. "I'm here, Daddy," I said. "I came home. I forgive you. Forgive me." I don't know how long I stayed. The light moved. When I finally walked back down the draw, there was a truck parked by the line shack, and Emmett Stroud was standing beside it with his hat in his hands. "Wanda told me," he said. He looked uncertain, which was new on him, about the lawyer calling. She didn't mean to talk out of turn. She just, there's no secrets in this county. He turned his hat in his hands. "I figured I'd find you out here. I don't know why." "Because it's mine," I said. The words came out before I could weigh them. I'd been holding the truth 19 years, and I was suddenly too tired to hold it one more minute, at least from him. "This place, this water. It's mine, Emmett. My name's not Quint, or it is, but it wasn't always. It's Hardesty. Cleve Hardesty was my father. I buried him in your pecan grove and cooked a meal and let you all believe I was a stranger because I didn't have it in me to be pitied. He was my daddy, and this is my land." I watched it land on him. I watched a man have the floor of his life tilt under him and stay standing, which not many can do. He didn't argue. He didn't get the wary, calculating look his brother got. He just went very still in that way he had, and looked up the draw toward the spring he couldn't see, and then back at me. And what was in his face wasn't fear for his ranch. It was something nearer to grief and nearer to shame, and I realized he was already, in that first second, doing the arithmetic that an honest man does. "Whose water? How long? How far back?" he said quietly. "How far back does it go?" 1849, I said, "when your people first dug their diversion. My family's right goes to 1911. Senior, your whole East Range, Emmett, half your cattle. They've been drinking my family's water for 70 years, and your daddy took it from mine in a dry year when my mother had just died and my father was too broke to fight. And then he let everybody in the county feel sorry for poor old Cleve, who couldn't get ahead." My voice cracked, and I let it. "He could have gotten ahead just fine. He owned the water that made all of you rich. He just gave it up rather than lose one more thing the year his wife died, and then he kept the right alive in law for 40 years, so that someday I'd have what your family could never steal." Emmett Stroud sat down, right there on the ground, on the dry grass by his truck, like his legs had quit. He took his hat all the way off and held it between his knees, and looked at the dirt for a long time. "I didn't know," he said. "I want you to hear me say it before there's lawyers and papers and my brother making it ugly. I did not know. I was 11 years old the summer your mother died. I remember it. I remember the dry, and I remember my daddy coming back from somewhere awful pleased with himself, and I remember old Cleve moving out to the shack and everybody saying he'd fallen on hard times. He looked up at me and his eyes were wet, which I had not expected from this weathered man. I have run this place my whole life thinking it was honest, thinking my daddy built it with his own 2 hands, and it was built on robbing a man who's lying out there in my pecan grove. He pressed the heel of his hand against his mouth. God Almighty, and you cooked our funeral meal. You stood in my dead wife's kitchen and fed the people come to bury your own father, and not one of us knew. And my brother stood there and called your daddy a man who couldn't plan ahead. Yes, I said. There wasn't anything else to say. It was all true. We stayed out there a long while, the 2 of us, the heat coming down, and the spring running cold up the draw where neither of us could see it. And I'll tell you something I've turned over many times since. I had come to that piece of ground full of 19 years of anger, ready to call the water and let the Strouds dry up and call the justice my father never got. And instead I sat in the dirt next to a man who was taking the whole weight of his father's sin onto his own back, without once trying to set it down on me. And the anger went on me like air out of tire. Slow. Complete. There just wasn't any place left for it to push against. What do you want? Emmett said finally. I'll tell you straight. I expect the law's on your side, and there's not a thing I can do to stop you, and I'm not going to try. If you want to call the water, you've got the right, and I won't fight you on it, and I won't blame you. The east range will burn up, and I'll have to sell down the herd, and maybe the place don't make it, and that'll be the price of what my family did, and it'll be a fair price. He said it level, like a man reading off a number. So you tell me, what do you want, Della? And I sat there with my whole life in my hands, and I found out what I wanted, and it surprised me as much as it'll maybe surprise you. I don't want your ranch to die. I said, I don't want your kids to lose their home 2 years after they lost their mama. That's not justice. That's just more grief, and I've cooked enough grief to last me. I looked at him. I want the truth told, out loud, in front of your brother and Cobb and whoever else, the whole of it, with no Stroud ever again getting to stand in a room and call my father a man who couldn't get ahead. I want my daddy's name set right. And then I want to figure out a way for that water to belong to who it belongs to and still keep your cows alive, because I think that's what a decent person does. And I think it's what my father would have wanted, God knows why, because he was a better person than I ever gave him credit for. Emmett Stroud looked at me for a long time. Then he stood up and put his hat back on and held out his hand to help me up off the ground. And his hand was the same rough, dry hand from the funeral, and I took it. And that was the first time, I think, that either one of us let ourselves know. The reading at Cobb's office that next week did not go like I'd planned, and that was because of Carl. We were all there, around the big table in the back room with the law books on the shelves. Cobb at the head, Emmett to his right, hat on his knee, gone quiet and grim, me across from them, and Carl, who had come in his usual way, loud and unworried, until Cobb opened the folder and started laying out the documents. And then I watched Carl Stroud's face change by degrees the way the sky changes before a hard storm. Cobb did it plain. He read the will. He laid out the deed to Section 14. He set down the certificate of adjudication and read the priority date out loud, 1911, and explained what senior meant, what it had always meant, and what it meant now. He laid the 40 years of tax receipts out in a fan across the table, like a hand of cards. He was thorough the way only an old country lawyer, who's been waiting decades for a thing, can be thorough. And Carl broke first, before Cobb had even finished, which told me everything. Now hold on, Carl said, half rising. Hold on. That water's been ours since before any of us were born. There's such a thing as abandonment. There's such a thing as adverse use. Cleve hadn't put that water to beneficial use in 50 years. That right lapsed. Everybody knows that. That's just how it works. No, Carl, Cobb said, mild as milk. That's how your daddy told you it works, because that's how he needed it to work. A senior right's not lost so easy as that. Not when a holder kept the deed and paid the taxes and filed protected, which Cleve did with me in this office. And I've got all right here. Your daddy bet a beaten man would never fight. He bet right, for a while. But Cleve never abandoned a thing in law. He just stopped using it, in fact. And there's a world of difference. and any judge in the state will tell you so. He tapped the certificate. This is good paper, Carl. It was always good paper. It's been sitting at the courthouse for 100 years, where anybody could have read it. The only reason nobody did is your daddy made sure nobody had cause to look. You can't prove what my daddy did or didn't do. Carl's voice had gone up. That's slander. That's an old man and an old woman cooking up a story to steal what we built. I'm not the one who stole, Carl. I said it quiet, but it cut through the room, and Carl turned on me. You were there. You were 17. You remember the summer my mama died. You remember your daddy coming home pleased with himself. Don't you sit there and tell this room you don't know exactly what happened, because I was a child in that house and I knew, and I was younger than you. And here's a moment, the one I've been turning over in dread for a week, where it could have gone to war, lawyers and lawsuits, and the whole county taking sides, the kind of fight that poisons the ground for generations. Carl had his mouth open to deny it again. I could see the lie loading up behind his teeth, the same lie his father had lived inside, the lie that I was a grasping stranger, and the Strouds were good people, and old Cleve had simply failed at life. It was Emmett who stopped it. Carl. Emmett hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved, but something in how he said his brother's name made the whole room go still, and Carl shut his mouth. Emmett turned his chair to face his brother, slow, and when he spoke it was the saddest, hardest thing I ever heard one brother say to another. You knew, Emmett said, all these years. You knew, and you let me run that place thinking we were honest men. You let me look those neighbors in the eye. You let me put my own children to bed in a house built on a robbed man, and you knew and you let me. His voice didn't break, but something behind it did. I was 11, Carl. You were near grown. You knew what Daddy did, and you've carried it 40 years, and you let me carry it without even telling me there was a weight on my back. That's the part one can't get past. Not what Daddy did. He's dead. But you let me be a thief in my own eyes and never even gave me the chance to make it right. The room was dead quiet. Cobb had taken his glasses off and was just watching, the way the old watch the storms they've seen coming a long time. And Carl Stroud, big loud Carl with his gold watch and his saucer buckle and his laugh, he used like a tool, put his face in his hands at his lawyer's table and came apart. I have seen a lot of grief. Like I told you, I have stood in a lot of kitchens and fed a lot of broken people. But I had never seen a thing quite like watching a proud, hard man finally set down a weight he'd been carrying since he was a boy, because that's what it was. It wasn't an act. It came up out of him from somewhere very deep and very old, and when he could finally talk, what came out wasn't excuses. I was 17, Carl said into his hands. He took me along that day, to the Hardesty place, to watch him do it. He wanted me to see how it was done, how you got ahead in this world. And I stood there in the yard while he told Cleve Hardesty the water wasn't his no more, and Cleve just... He stopped. His shoulders shook. Cleve didn't even fight. That's what I've never been able to forget. A grown man. And he just stood there with his hat in his hands and took it. Because his wife had just died and he was all wrung out, and my daddy walked back to the truck whistling. Whistling. Carl looked up, and his face was wet and gray and 40 years old all at once. I knew it was wrong. I was 17, and I knew it was the wrongest thing I ever saw. And I never said one word, because I was scared of my daddy, and then I was scared of losing the ranch, and then I was just scared, and the longer I went, the more I had to lose. And I figured if I never said it out loud, maybe it'd stay buried. I have been scared every single day of my life that this exact thing would happen, that somebody'd open that courthouse drawer. He looked at me, and there wasn't any fight left in him anywhere. I'm sorry. God help me, I am so sorry. To you, to your daddy, to my own brother. I let ride my whole life, and I'm sorry. Nobody said anything for a while. Through the open window, the courthouse clock chimed the hour, slow. And somewhere down on the square, a truck door shut, and a dog barked. And the ordinary day went on outside that room, where 4 people sat with 70 years of buried truth finally laid out on the table. I thought about my father standing in his own yard with his hat in his hands, taking it, not fighting, walking off to live small and silent for 40 years rather than lose one more thing the year his wife died. And I thought about Carl. A scared boy who watched it and never could shake it, and grew into a scared man building a louder and louder life over a thing he couldn't bury deep enough. And I understood, sitting there, that the cruelty Carl Stroud carried around, the bluster, and the pricing everything eyes, and the way he made a room of grieving people about himself, all of it had grown up out of that one day in that yard. Out of shame he never had the courage to name. Hurt people will do near anything to keep from looking at the thing that hurt them. I knew that better than most. I'd run 19 years from a man I loved rather than look at the day he disappointed me. "All right," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "All right, Carl." That was all. I didn't make him grovel. There wasn't any point, and it wouldn't have been justice. It would just have been me doing to him a smaller version of what his daddy did to mine, putting a man down in the dirt to make myself feel bigger. My father stood in that yard and took the worst day of his life with his hat in his hands and his dignity intact, and I figured the only way to be his daughter, the only way to set his name right that meant anything, was to do the same, to stand in the worst of it and not become it. So I told him what I wanted, and we worked it out over the next month, with Cobb drawing up the papers honest this time. The water right stayed mine. That was not negotiable, and Emmett never asked it to be. The 1911 senior right, and the deed to Section 14, the Hardesty quarter with the spring. Those were my father's gift to me, and they would stay in my name, recorded clean at the courthouse, set right at last. But I leased the use of the water to the Stroud Ranch by a written agreement at a fair price, with the senior right protected, so that it could never again be taken or lost or quietly stolen. In a true drought, when there isn't enough, the Hardesty right gets satisfied first, the way the law always meant. But in the ordinary run of years, there's plenty for spring to keep its own draw green and water the Stroud cattle besides. And so the cows would not die and the children would not lose their home and a decent man would not be ruined for sins of his father. And we did one more thing, at my asking, that mattered to me more than the water. We put it in writing, and Cobb made it part of the record, that the Hardesty water right had never been abandoned, that Cleve Hardesty had held it lawfully his whole life, that the Stroud operations use of that water from 1949 forward had been junior to and dependent upon the senior Hardesty right, and that the historical record was hereby corrected. Plain legal language. But what it meant, what it really meant, was that it was now written down forever, where anybody in Kimball County could read it for the next 100 years, that old Cleve Hardesty was not a man who couldn't get ahead. He was a man who owned the water that made the Strouds rich, and gave it up rather than lose his dignity in a dry year, and kept the right alive in law for 40 years out of love for a daughter who didn't deserve it yet. My father's name, set right, in ink, in the same courthouse where Burl Stroud thought he'd buried the truth. That was a justice. Not the money. That. Carl signed it. His hand shook, but he signed it every page. And when it was done, he stood up and put out his hand to me, and I took it. And we didn't say much, but something had changed his face that I don't think ever changed back. The fear was gone out of it. A man who spent 40 years scared of a buried thing, and finally watches it come up out of the ground, and survives it. He walks different after. Lighter, even though he's lost. Especially because he's lost. Carl stepped back from running the ranch not long after, by his own choice, took to spending his time elsewhere. Came around less. But when he did come around, in the years after, he was a quieter and a kinder man than the one who ate my brisket at my father's funeral and called him a failure. I'd like to think setting the thing down finally let him be who he might have been before that day in the yard broke something in a 17-year-old boy. I don't know. People are hard to read. But he was gentler with Asa. I noticed, gentle the way a man is when he's trying to make up for something he can't name to a child who'll never know what it was. I like to tell you about how the rest of it went. The part the lawyers and the water rights don't cover. The part that's really the story. If I'm honest, I started going out to the Stroud place more. To see to the spring, I told myself, and there was some truth in it. A senior right holder's got cause to keep an eye on her water. But that was a lie. The small kind. The kind Emmett always let me keep. The truth was I'd started cooking out there on Sundays. It began with Asa. The boy had taken to me at the funeral and never quit, the way some grieving children will fix on the first soft thing that comes near them. He'd show up at the spring while I was there and just be around, throwing rocks in the water with Biscuit, the one-eared dog, flopped beside him, not saying much, the way his daddy didn't say much. And one Sunday I drove out, and Emmett was trying to feed those children supper out of cans, a tired man heating beans on a stove in a kitchen that still had his dead wife's recipe box sitting out untouched, and I couldn't stand it. I just couldn't. I rolled up my sleeves and I made them a real supper, chicken fried steak and gravy and biscuits and a peach cobbler, and I watched that little boy eat like he had a hot meal cooked by a woman's hands in 2 years, because he hadn't. Junie was harder. Junie was 14 and full of grief gone sideways into anger, and she watched me move around her dead mother's kitchen with a look that could have stripped paint, and I understood it, every bit of it. The last thing a grieving girl wants is some woman she doesn't know cooking in her mama's kitchen, out of her mama's pots, like she belongs there. I'd have hated me too. So I didn't try to be her mother. That was the thing. I never once tried to fill that chair. I made a point of asking Junie how Marion had done things, what her mama's biscuits were like. Did she want her mama's recipe box left right where it was? And the answer was always a hard shrug. But I kept asking, and I kept leaving the recipe box exactly where it sat, and I never touched a half-finished quilt on the frame in the front room. Not once, not to move it an inch. I let that house keep its grief. I just cooked around it. And one Sunday, months in, I was making cobbler, and I was short a hand. And without thinking, I said, "Junie, would you peach these for me?" And held out the paring knife. And that girl stood there a long moment with her arms crossed. And then she came and took the knife and peeled the peaches. And we worked side by side at the counter, not saying a word. And her shoulders came down about an inch. The same inch her daddy's came down looking at his sleeping boy. And I knew not to say anything about it. You don't startle a wild thing that's decided to come close. You just keep still and keep working and let it come. It was a long time before either of those children called me anything but Della, and I never pushed for more. Because a thing like that you don't earn by asking, you earn by staying, and I had spent my whole life leaving, and I had decided I was done leaving. Emmett and I were slow. We were two people who'd been hurt and gone hard, and we weren't 17, neither one of us. And there's a particular care that two grown people take with each other when they both know exactly what it costs to lose somebody. It was a year of Sunday suppers before he ever took my hand on the porch in the evening. The locusts going in the cedar, the windmill turning slow against the last light. It was a year after that before either of us said the word out loud. We had time. That was the gift of being our age. We didn't have to rush, because we both already knew the worst thing had already happened and survived it. And everything after was just grace we hadn't expected to get. But I'll tell you the moment it turned, for me, the moment I knew. It was a hard, dry August, the worst in years. The country burned tan and gasping. Stock tanks gone cracked mud all over the county, and ranchers selling down their herds, and some folks losing everything. And the hardest spring ran cold and clear up its draw the way it had for 100 years. The way it ran the year I knelt down and forgave my father, never quitting, never even slowing. And it kept the Stroud cattle alive when half the county's herds were going to the sale barn. The senior right, satisfied first, the way the law always meant and Burrow Stroud always feared. Emmett and I rode out to the spring together one evening that August, horseback, to check the water, and we sat our horses up on the rise looking down at that one green draw in all the gray and burned country, the pecans dark and full of the silver water, and Emmett took his hat off, which I'd learned by then he only did at grave or in church or when something had gone all the way through him. "Your daddy kept this," he said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the water. 40 years. For you, so that someday. He stopped. He turned his horse a little to face me. "Della, I have spent 2 years thinking the best part of my life was over and behind me, that I'd had my one good thing, and lost it, and the rest was just keeping the place running till I was done. And then a woman came up my drive with 2 ice chests of brisket in a secret, to bury her own father, and stood in my dead wife's kitchen and didn't make a sound at his grave. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.